Hello everyone, this video is not just about Destiny, but about a specific kind of people who use the following two argumentations with regards to systemic racism. The first is also known as the racism of the gaps fallacy. It occurs when researchers who are studying these sorts of disparities are not adding certain variables in their research, and because those variables are missing, as a consequence, all the data that was not explained by the primary identifiable variables is now attributed to a mysterious variable of systemic or structural racism of white people perpetrated against black people. However, when you show that it is not the case by, for example, bringing up sentencing disparities, as it is often brought up, and proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that there is no bias among the jury aside from jurors expressing a pro-black biases if they happen to be black by a factor of 15 times, according to this meta-analysis, and in the recent times, even when the jury happens to be white, they still express a pro-black bias. Similar with shootings, whenever you prove them that it is actually white people who are more likely to be shot by the police than blacks, if you control for the crime rate, as well as you look at reaction before shooting, as did Roland Fryer, you see a different picture. And similarly, if you look at ethnocentrism in the United States population, you can clearly see that blacks are way more ethnocentric than whites are. Yet, nonetheless, a person who is not familiar with these sorts of data would say that blacks get shot more per capita and receive longer sentences when you are not controlling for other variables such as the severities of their crimes, for example. And now, if you wish to hear a more nuanced take on those assertions, I suggest you to read a series of articles that Sean Last had written about systemic racism. Given his last debate with Stardust, he knows way more about it than I do, and probably most of researchers, whom he references in his articles constantly and often critiques their methodology. Instead, I will try to do something different, and unlike Sean, I'll get on the logical side of this debate and not the empirical side, for which there is plenty of evidence of. But before that, I'll just let you know that there are those two brilliant Telegram channels, History Memes Official for sharing historical memes and History Quizzes for testing your historical knowledge, so make sure to check them out. But anyways, let's go back to the video. Nor Vosh or Destiny or any other notorious YouTuber leftist is familiar with much of the empirical data at ground, but despite that, they think that they live in a world that is underlined by racial oppression because outcomes between races are different. Because as they have already established by their moralistic fallacy, the races don't differ in any metrics whatsoever. Now, as I have mentioned, when it comes to race and incarceration, when you control for crimes of different races and other variables, those disparities are gone. Let's look at it in another example. It is often brought up that the fact that whites and blacks have different incomes in employment, where whites earn more than blacks, it is often attributed to be another proof of systemic racism. But when you control for IQ, those disparities are actually reversed. Typically all across the board, when you do things like that, it just disappears. Yet it would not matter, because leftists don't actually realize what control means and just complain about there being difference in outcomes. Here, for example, is Destiny talking about it. And by the way, which voice do you like more? How I speak now or how I spoke previously? Assuming of course I can work on the audio and remove the background noises. This is basically my natural voice on Sony Vegas without any manipulations as I usually do. But anyways, let me go ahead and play you Destiny.
I mean, you can explain it.
Sure. So typically the idea, in a very, very basic broad sense, if we're just talking about privilege, is that some people have advantages over other people that are based on certain traits that weren't necessarily earned. So these traits could be skin color or starting wealth or family status, etc., etc. And that the idea is that being black generally doesn't carry with it as many societal advantages or privileges as being white for a variety of reasons. The big deal with systemic or structural racism, okay? Please, I want to hear everybody repeating this fucking 2 years from now and nobody can give me credit for it. I don't give a fuck, okay? The big thing about structural or systemic racism is that it works without any bad actors, is that it perpetuates itself without any individual hating black people explicitly or implicitly. This idea that you need all these people to be implicitly racist or whatever against somebody, and that if we can just fix that, these problems go away, it's not true. Like, these things require like bigger structural upheaval or bigger breakings of the cycle than just making people more aware of their implicit biases. All right.
For him, it is evident that racism is when there are unequal outcomes, and not when there is discrimination. He, unlike Vash, who is another leftist, does not claim that white people are racist and it's their fault, for some reason probably knowing how ridiculous it sounds given all the empirical data at hand. Instead, he vaguely appeals to a mysterious system, which apparently is the cause of all of these problems, because humans have no agency. In other words, the assertion just becomes unfalsifiable. There are no racist people who are doing it, but somehow, because for example blacks receive an unweighted jail sentence of 16% more than whites, some mysterious force is forcing those outcomes. Often the force is viewed by them as the system, yet whenever asked to provide any specific policies or rules which lead to those disparities, they can't name a single one. They just understand any racial differences in outcomes as a proof of systemic racism and not other factors that lead to that. It is likely that they just repeat it without actually knowing what the hell they're talking about. The problem with that sort of an approach is that given the emotional weight of the word, the implications are way greater than what the word actually describes. The fact that blacks commit crimes and go to jail for it, it's not the fault of the supposed system, but the fault of blacks themselves. However, when it is implied that it's all a result of systemic racism stretching from 1619, it removes the responsibility from blacks, which falls on the shoulders of whites, who are ultimately blamed for it, even though destiny would deny it and blame the supposed undefined system. The issue with that is that whenever you look at sentencing disparities, you're most likely to look at it from a racial perspective, which ultimately draws your attention away from the sexual disparity, because one thing is that barely mentioned now as a result of Black Lives Matter and the United States adopting black people as their religion, is that men receive way more longer sentences than women, and this difference is significantly more higher than white to black sentencing disparities, which ultimately goes away when you control for everything that is possible, and barely anyone is actually talking about it. However, if the dominant narrative in our culture was the systemic oppression of men by the system, then any other explanation of male to female disparities would be attributed to it. However, strangely enough, because of popularity of feminism, what is going on is those conversations, but turned upside down, with everything being attributed to patriarchy, even the female-male sentencing disparity, for some strange reason, because apparently it's in the interests of men to have longer sentences than women. Unfortunately, given that the religion of the United States is black people, much of the discussion is shaped by those lenses, and whatever little support one can harness will be interpreted as a proof of systemic racism. For example, an observation that black people having 10 times less wealth is seriously attributed to systemic racism, which is very funny considering that the gap has increased since the 1970s and continues to. And same with most other metrics, be it intelligence, crime, or single motherhood. If anything, the gap is widening parallel to society's improved treatment of blacks, to a point where they are treated better than whites, as evident by their portrayal in the popular culture, the affirmative action, and the welfare state. Yet, despite all of that, they continue to lag behind. What those things have accomplished, however, is improved the happiness and the ego of blacks relative to whites, in addition to the diminished accurate stereotypes about blacks, who are now seen as competent Chad's alpha males, who are brave warriors and smart leaders and police officers if you watch any of the TV shows. But to prove the nature of unfalsifiability of systemic racism, consider this. A clear analogy with Christianity. First, it was claimed that God orders society and directly intervenes in it, as well as he is the creator of men and women and the earth, which is flat and is about 7,000 years old, which assumes that God is material and evolution does not exist. Then, as we understood more, we started dropping off these claims one by one, and now Christianity is basically left to claim that God may or may not intervene in society, and you just have to take a little leap of faith or have a mystical experience, in addition to saying that he is all-knowing and all-powerful and immaterial and etc., which basically means he is unfalsifiable. Notice that this new understanding of God is a sort of God that cannot be proven, as he is first cannot be defined and second is not material, and now contrasted to the earlier understanding of God, when science was going hand in hand with the Catholic Church, who all considered God to be a subject of scientific inquiry, unlike now. The evolution of systemic racism narrative looks about the same. In the 1960s, there were legitimate codified barriers in the system, if you will, not allowing blacks to have equal treatment by whites and compete on the same level. In the 1970s and 80s, all of those barriers were removed and affirmative action was instated. However, the society generally disapproved of mixed-race marriages and engaged in accurate stereotype assessments. It was the time of addressing to what extent are people biased against black, and there were plenty of studies to prove that it was the case. Now, however, given that whites are proven to be way less racist than blacks on frankly all studies, approving of blacks on all surveys, and even show a pro-black bias, another component of systemic racism is gone, which is people who are racist. But in the present time, Destiny is saying no, whites are not racist against blacks, it's just the system is structured in this way or something which requires no one to actually perpetrate it. And whenever you ask them of what the system actually is, given that they fail to prove police bias or some other variables, they magically resort to redlining, slavery and etc., and ignoring the fact that the economic plight of blacks have been deteriorating since the 1950s and continues so. And I'll let you know it has nothing to do with racism, as it has an inverse relationship with it. Another issue which automatically stems from it is the fact that you can actually make case for systemic racism against another group, notably whites. Now, it is true that due to affirmative action, Asians are discriminated more than whites in college applications, however, they are not discriminated in diversity initiatives, and having an Asian working for a company is considered to be diverse, unlike if it was to be a white man. Moreover, Asians are not painted as evil by the popular culture, and no legitimate media is spreading hate against them, not to mention they don't suffer from the negative consequences of being automatically assumed of being racist, nor are they blamed for their own history, unlike whites. I think to identify whether there is a systemic discrimination or racism against a particular group, certain conditions have to be met. First, there need to be certain governmental or institutional laws that are designed to diminish a particular group's influence. Second, this group is demonized in the popular culture and generally resented by other groups. Third, this group is not allowed to self-organize and pursue their own self-interests. Fourth, there are employment and law enforcement mistreatment against this group. And fifth, it is seen as acceptable in society to express negative feelings towards this particular group. Now, this is just what I came up with for something as vague as systemic racism, and if you follow this chart closely while comparing it to different groups of people in a given country all across the world, a group which fits at least 3 or more of these criteria may be considered to be systemically discriminated against. I know it is not perfect and I will be willing to revise it if I were to receive some criticism, but for something as vague as systemic racism, I think it does a pretty good job. Now, I know I haven't included any differences in economic outcomes of these groups, however, one cannot equate intrinsic poor performance of a given group to an external group or a system unless this group would fit most of the criteria already listed in front of you, and only then it will be used as in support of the systemic racism argument. But anyways, that was it for today. Thank you for watching, and I would appreciate if you could send $1 or $2 on Subscribestar or PayPal.